Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the Iron Fanfics, back with amazing fanfiction. This is the series of What If Deku Had Mermaid Mutation Quirk? Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Inko loved her son with all of her heart. And yet, if she wanted him to live, she'd have to let him go. It would be impossible really. She couldn't keep him any longer. Therefore, it was with a heavy heart that Inko Midoriya wrapped her child with all the care she could manage and gave him a tight and loving hug, wishing that she didn't have to leave her own son whom she had grown to love so much in the short time that she had him. The ocean could be quite ruthless sometimes. Tearfully, after setting him a safe and comfortable distance from the roiling tidal waves, the woman turned back the way she came, the impact of her loss echoing throughout her bones like a knell with each unsteady footfall. If anyone on Dagobah Beach saw a woman disappear into the ocean, they might have thought it to be a trick of the eyes. How likely could it possibly be for anyone to be out at such an hour, especially a lone woman? Something flashed before the sunrise like glistening emeralds in the sunlight before dipping back into the water. However, it was very unlikely that it would be seen again. It was a very peaceful day for the Bakugou family. Mitsuki Bakugou had taken a week off to spend some time with her husband, Masaru, and her son, Katsuki, who was just short of 4 months old. Side by side, they strolled together down Mizudafu's sandy shoreline, the sound of the waves ebbing away any last of their worries. Even Katsuki, for his continually ear-splitting cries, seemed to be calm, if the soft, even breaths on Mitsuki's arm were any indication. With nothing but her husband, her son, and the waters of Dagobah that endlessly reached out into the horizon, Mitsuki was glad to be where she was. All in all, it was the perfect way to spend a free afternoon. As Beach's small boardwalk came into view, a high-pitched noise brought both Mitsuki and Masaru back into focus. They would have kept walking in sheer disbelief, given that there was no one but them around. However, it was the familiarity of the noise that made them stop in their tracks. The noise was coming from up ahead, where the only visible structure was. Therefore, the couple didn't even need glance around the barren beach, quickly deducing that the maker of the noise was underneath the boardwalk. Since it was Mitsuki who held their own son, Masaru took the initiative to clear the distance between his wife and the walkway. Swaddled in thick fishing net, seaweed, and rope mesh was the little noisemaker. It was a baby that likely was no older than Katsuki. It was almost indiscernible from where it was placed. If the baby had not been crying, they might have simply mistaken the small baby as part of the usual debris that tended to wash up on the beach and accumulated beneath the pier. Masaru crouched, reached beneath the boardwalk's low beams, and plucked the baby from the gravel, not wanting to keep it on the hard beach any longer. At the motion, its cries loudened. "Easy there," Masaru soothed. It's okay. He rocked back and forth like he did with Katsuki. Hopefully this one would calm down faster. It was apparent that some of the rope and netting was obstructing the baby's head and neck movements. With the utmost care, Masaru set to gently uncovering the baby's head, tangles of seaweed, rope, and mesh falling to the ground. Once its head was free, the baby had quieted down somewhat. Something else dropped from the bundle, but Masaru caught it before it could fall. Small and metallic, the silvery pendant brightly shined in the noonday sun, a stark contrast to the dark kanji inscribed on the metal. Midoriya Izuku. Izuku, repeated Masaru, testing the name on his tongue. It was the name of a boy. At the sound of his voice, a set of viridian eyes opened, and he couldn't help but be captivated by their vibrance. "Aren't you cute?" His wife was coming up behind him, quiet but inquiring. Like him, she also wondered who would desert their child on the beach, a baby no less, and leave it to the world, which was especially dangerous for one so defenseless. "Mitsuki," Masaru said lowly. "I don't think anyone is coming back for this one." "Is that your code for wanting to keep him?" She replied, equally quiet. Masaru was right, Mitsuki supposed, as she got a look at the baby herself. Izuku was adorable, and Masaru could tell that she was just as mesmerized by the soft, round features and bright green eyes as he was. "He's very cute, Masaru, but we can't keep another baby. Not when the old company laid everyone off." Always the rational one when Masaru got impulsive, Mitsuki voiced her own concerns, which caused Katsuki to stir a bit at the accompanying noise and motions. She stilled when she realized this, as Mitsuki didn't want to wake Katsuki up, nor did she want to agitate another baby that was unlikely to have had any food in the past day. Right now, I can't even call my own job an actual job yet. I know, honey, but look at him. Besides, you said so yourself that you'd want another one. Masaru eyed his own son before shifting his attention back to Izuku. The man tried one last time. He'll make a great brother for Katsuki. All right, Masaru. Mitsuki finally relented, shoulders slumping in defeat. And Masaru called her stubborn. We'll keep the baby, and we'll get the papers signed as soon as we can. She paused for a moment before speaking again. But if he's going to be a part of the family, he'll need a name change, no buts from you. Since it was clear that whoever had dropped him off at the beach was never coming back, Izuku would not need the surname of the person or people that had abandoned him. They had only been in possession of this wide-eyed baby covered in litter and seaflora for such a short while, and there was already a need for the two parents to take Izuku for themselves to keep him as one of their own. Leave it to her husband to get them both attached to a baby within the first 5 minutes of finding him. What about the apartment though? It's going to be too small for all of us in a year. Masaru was certain that he and his wife would both have employment and a steady income in a year, so he allowed himself to laugh. We'll buy a house then. There was no doubt that in due time this baby that they found would be a great member of their family. It was settled then. Bakugou Izuku. Izuku, even for being around his own boisterous family, seemed to run on a completely different wavelength than the rest of the Bakugou household. For one, where his dad, mom, and even his own brother were strictly early sleepers, there'd be some occasions at which Izuku would forego his bedtime until midnight. At the cost of their own precious sleep, Masaru and Mitsuki would take turns keeping watch after their especially curious child. They didn't want to know what he'd get into as they slept. So, instead of forcing the youngest of their household to bed, the two parents would keep him company until he eventually tired himself out on his own. Another unique aspect of the green-haired member of the Bakugou family was his quiet, yet thoughtful demeanor. Where Katsuki contented himself with the spotlight, showing off his kanji knowledge or some flashy trick on the playground, Izuku preferred books and toys. He was especially fascinated with a notebook that had been lying around the house for quite some time, and thus he had taken it as his own, filling it with doodles, kanji, and whatever else would take his interest. Still, he didn't mind when his mother or father would take him outside to play with Kaken. Izuku greatly enjoyed their outdoor romps and adventures. Some of their best memories were made at the beach near their house that they had moved to years ago, since the apartments in the upper suburbs were much too small to fit a family of their size. Izuku loved to splash and play in the water as a toddler, and now that he was a little older, he had finally learned to swim. On Katsuki's irregularly quiet days, it was also nice when he would take interest in Izuku's notebooks, sometimes adding his own pictures into the mix. There was also the fact that Izuku was very much a bleeding heart. That was something that no one could really help, no matter how much either Mitsuki or Katsuki teased him in jest. He cried for the littlest of things, in fact. On one occasion, Izuku burst into tears when Kaken told him where katsudon came from. Although he got over it shortly after his mom nearly forced him to eat it, he couldn't help that it was so tasty. Mostly, however, Izuku cried for others, before trying with all his might to help them or make them feel better, unlike Katsuki who could be so brash and unapologetic sometimes. The two boys were polar opposites in almost every aspect, but there was one topic that could captivate them both: heroes. With matched looks of awe, they watched as the brand new hero, All Might, made his debut, carrying dozens upon dozens of people out from a mountain of blazing debris. It was amazing. Moreover, he was amazing. And so the two boys wanted to be just like him as heroes. They couldn't wait until they got their quirks. As a Bakugou by blood, both Masaru and Mitsuki expected their firstborn to grow up strong and hardy like them. With such a formidable quirk explosions from the palm of his hands, how could he not? However, of all outcomes for his second son, Masaru had thought this one to be the last. Quirkless. Izuku was quirkless. An extra toe joint. Masaru remembered the little factoid from grade school. It was simple really. If an individual had the joint, they lacked the quirk. Although it was very likely that Izuku could manifest a quirk, especially when 80% of the world had powers, there was no way to determine his own lineage and thereby his affinity for the quirk factor. He and Mitsuki had scoured endlessly through public records and the internet with zero success. The name Midoriya was non-existent. Yet he couldn't help but feel the same palpable grief that radiated off Izuku. Amid Masaru's thoughts, the doctor spoke up. Is it because his genes? The blonde man nearly shouted. The seething glare that Masaru sent the doctor's way went unnoticed by Izuku. The expression was very uncharacteristic upon his face. Of course the doctor knew. Mitsuki had probably told him during one of Izuku's previous checkups. We don't know where those genes came from, Dr. Tsubasa. Oh. At least the mustachioed doctor looked apologetic, realization dawning. I see, and neither does Izuku, I suppose. I guess we're done here. Dr. Tsubasa ushered the two out of the office, nearly catching Izuku in the door before he waved a farewell. Good day to you, Mr. Bakugou. Izuku, for having such free-flowing tear ducts, managed to hide his sadness well. He could only stare haplessly at his feet, wishing for his toes to be like Kaken's. When they got home from the checkup, however, Izuku was nowhere to be found. Mitsuki was seated at the table, sorting through some bills. Meanwhile, Katsuki played his Game Boy on the couch, only looking up from his game when Masaru burst through the door. I take it that it didn't go well, Masaru? Purple bags lined his eyes, his ash-blonde hair was disheveled, and his white knuckles gripped the doorframe like a vice. By the looks of it, the trip to the doctor had not gone well. He took a few deep breaths to calm himself before making his way into the foyer. He didn't even have to answer Mitsuki's question, opting to ask, have either of you seen Izuku? Mitsuki looked thoughtful for a second, and then, Izuku, get your butt downstairs before I pull you by the hair. The house was met by silence. Honey, that doesn't even work on Izuku anymore, Masaru said while pushing his lopsided glasses up the bridge of his nose. Yeah, well, Katsuki's a bad influence on him. She quipped back, retrieving a coat. Without further preamble, the two made for the door, but not before Mitsuki marched back inside and grabbed Katsuki by the wrist before he could protest. Come on, shitface, you're going for a walk. Dagoba Beach passed by in a blur. The Bakugas were nearly jogging, the pastels of the sand and darker waves melding together in a rush as the sun dipped beneath the water. A wooden structure came into view, and Mitsuki's hand tightened on Katsuki's wrist. The other hand was busy wiping off some of her glycerin sweat that had gathered in excess. She wasn't the only one who nearly halted at the sight of the pier, as she could see that the veins in her husband's neck were nearly bursting from their sockets. Sobbing. The noise was so faint that the parents might have thought of it as a trick of the mind, but when the keening noise pierced the air once more, both Masaru and Mitsuki knew that Izuku was definitely nearby. However, neither of them could see Izuku atop or below the pier. I think. Masaru swallowed an especially thick lump in his throat, fighting back the effects of déjà vu. I think Izuku's on the other side. Before he moved any further, he turned behind him. Katsuki-chan, why don't you sit on the pier while we get your brother? He acquiesced, clambering up the wooden steps and disappearing up the pier, and then Masaru and Mitsuki were back in motion. True to their intuition, Izuku was curled up between some of the beach's few rocks, obscured from the other side of the dock. Masaru and Mitsuki plopped down on either side of him. Hey, Mom, Izuku shakily said. Did Dad tell you what happened already? What happened, Izuku? There could only be one reason that Izuku's checkup had gone so horribly without having him sent to an emergency room, and Mitsuki had an idea as to what it was. Did something happen at the doctor? Izuku didn't respond, another sob racking his small frame. Instead he asked, Where's Kaken? Neither parent answered, and Izuku's fretful eyes widened exponentially. Could you not tell him that I don't have a quirk? I don't want him to be sad about me. Masaru released a long sigh before answering. Your heart is in the right place, Izuku, but you can't hide something like that from your brother forever. Katsuki was a very intuitive child, and he was not one to hesitate if he wanted answers. Eventually, he's going to find out on his own. Or he might beat the crap out of you unless you tell. Mitsuki added, hoping the little joke would cheer him up. It didn't, and Izuku looked even more upset than he had been. She tried again. Still, it's not the end of the world, Izuku. It is, Mom. Because, Izuku cried out, little fists shaking at his sides. There was more than just the issue of his quirklessness that twisted his features into consternation. Because if I don't have a quirk, then I can't become a hero. For once, the two parents were at a complete loss on how to take care of the relatively easygoing Izuku. Mitsuki considered Izuku's statement for a moment. Sure, there were never any quirkless heroes in history, but Izuku, despite his emotional personality, was as strong as the rest of their clan. If anyone had the drive, the determination, and the will to become the first quirkless hero, it was Izuku. Izuku, Masaru started, putting Mitsuki's thoughts into words, and it seemed that his mind was on the same page as hers. Being the calmer of the two parents, he had always been more proficient in handling Izuku, while Mitsuki was more apt in dealing with her own mirror image of an older son. I don't think that the fact that you don't have a quirk should stop you from becoming a hero. And I also believe that, if anyone could become the first quirkless hero, then it definitely would be you. It appeared that Masaru said the right thing, when all the tension seemed to seep from his shoulders. For another short while, the three of them sat there together, listening to the calming waves and watching the sunset. Izuku had stopped crying for the most part, but the remnants of his woes still showed on his reddened face. He was definitely exhausted from the events of the day. However, from what Mitsuki and Masaru could also see, his emerald eyes still were bright despite the overt sadness filled with wonder and determination. They still sparkled like a beacon. They shined with hope. Come on you two, Kaken's gonna get restless if we leave him up there for too long. Mitsuki let Masaru pluck Izuku up from the beach once more. They were both thankful that he was still small enough to carry. On the way back, Katsuki was abnormally quiet. For some odd reason, he refused to even look at Izuku, his red eyes remaining trained on the ground. Why couldn't Izuku get a quirk? Katsuki quietly fumed. He had watched the whole conversation between Izuku and his parents, unbeknownst to the rest of his family. His brother knew so much about pro heroes, maybe even more than himself. Still, even if he didn't have a quirk, Katsuki would see to it that his brother would someday join him in the ranks of heroes. Together, they would become the best pro heroes. Despite his quirklessness, Bakugou Izuku grew up like every other normal kid, well, as normal as anybody could be in an age of quirks. Katsuki, for his prickly attitude, cared deeply for his brother, even though he'd never say it outright, and so he made sure to keep Izuku included, even in the presence of his gaggle of quirked friends. If those extras didn't want Izuku on their adventures, then Katsuki would take Izuku on his own. Even for his young age, with his powerful quirk, a quirk that was still growing, the boy was a force to be reckoned with, and to Izuku his quirk was the coolest, even as cool as All Might's. Izuku may not have had a quirk, but he certainly was special in his own right. He had a very quick, analytical mind, able to pull apart heroes' strengths and weaknesses within seconds. His raw intelligence put him at the top of his classes, right next to his brother. Sometimes, unbeknownst to Izuku, Katsuki would get into several fights over his brother's quirkless status. He received punishment from his elders for using his quirk on other students, but he'd never tell their parents why he did it. They just assumed it was Katsuki's boundless anger. The two still played at Dagoba Beach from time to time. However, it wasn't as clean as it had once been, with a few, large pieces of scrap metal littering the sand. Izuku and Katsuki recalled a clearer version of the beach that had once been their favorite playground. They hoped that someone would clean it soon, otherwise nobody would enjoy it anymore. Still, the two boys grew, played, and fought together, even when they could no longer visit the beach due to the amounts of trash that it had accumulated. Katsuki had his own friends, and Izuku had his own separate interests, but nothing could change the fact that they were brothers, even if they didn't know their true differences. Izuku's 13th birthday came and went in the late summer, unbeknownst to him. In fact, a pediatrician was able to use his quirk to calculate Izuku's exact age and date of birth, and Mitsuki and Masaru discovered that Izuku was only a few months younger than Katsuki. So as to not raise any questions between the two boys, Izuku's birthday was celebrated a good 10 months after Katsuki's, although the occasion of his actual birthday was typically marked by Masaru and Mitsuki with a surprise katsudon dinner, Izuku's favorite meal. About a week later from his 13th birthday, Izuku woke up from a series of anxious dreams. Izuku could barely recall what had happened, but it felt as if the lives of his family were in danger. There was also the need to save his family from the unseen danger. He didn't know why he'd been so addled by a simple dream, but, just in case, Izuku made a sweep of the house to ensure that his family was still alive and breathing. Much to Izuku's complete and utter relief, his mom and dad were at the kitchen table, drinking coffee. When he went to check Kaken, which was more or less Izuku putting a finger to his temple to check his pulse, he got a punch to the thigh as a thanks. Same old Kaken. Thinking about it, Izuku supposed he lived the perfect life. He had a loving family, his abrasive brother included, a house near the beach, and good grades. Even without a quirk, he was looking forward to his days at UA, his dream school, with Kaken. It would be a little over 2 years until he graduated, but he just couldn't wait. Reaching for a towel, he moved to dry off his face when What? Izuku stared in shock, bringing a hand up to his neck in sheer disbelief of the image that looked back at him. All over his face and trailing down his neck were little, black spots. When they hit the light, they almost seemed to shine green. Izuku noted that the surface felt smooth, yet slightly bumpy. With trembling hands he reached for the medicine cabinet, throwing its contents into disarray as he searched for his prize. His hand tightened when it met the familiar metal of the tweezers. Because his school uniform could hide the rest, Izuku began with his face. One by one he carefully tore off each scale, wincing with each pull. He needed to know, he really wanted to get these things off in case they were a disease and his mom and dad and Kaken would worry. "Deku." Katsuki pounded on the door. He never called Izuku that unless he was especially angry. "What's going on in there?" Startled, Izuku dropped the tweezers, which clattered onto the floor. I found a boil." "Then why the hell are you screaming bloody murder about it?" "It's a really big boil." Izuku all but screeched. The doorknob twisted, and he instantly lunged for the lock that he had forgotten to use. "Don't come in." There was quiet and a shuffling of feet, before Katsuki tersely huffed from the other side of the door. "You're disgusting, you know that?" Izuku let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding, his brother having given up for the time being. Besides, there was only one way out of the bathroom, so he'd be facing his brother again whether he wanted to or not. By the time Izuku gazed in the mirror once more, the scales on his skin had completely disappeared. Where he had plucked the scales, there was a large, bleeding cut in their place. At least he could really pass it off as a boil, since the cut only covered one general area. Just in case, Izuku grabbed a sizable bandage and taped it over the edge of his cheek. When he finally came out of the bathroom, Katsuki eyed Izuku with a scrutinizing gaze. "The boil's gone." Izuku grinned none too convincingly, one hand curled into a tight fist. Katsuki raised an eyebrow at the bandage but otherwise said nothing. Izuku could be so gross sometimes. With the hallway clear, Izuku opened his hand to inspect the abrasions that had been on his skin not even minutes earlier. He stared intently at the scales he collected, watching them turn from black to greenish as he moved his hand in and out of the sunlight and hoping that whatever had occurred would not happen again. It didn't take long for Izuku to realize that the scales, as there was no other proper word for the obtrusions on his skin, appeared when his skin touched liquid. Water, milk, and even some bleach that he accidentally spilled on himself earlier in the week were all fair game. Thankfully, they completely dried off in 5 minutes with the help of a towel. With a hairdryer, Izuku could rid himself of the scales in less than a minute. If this was the extent of the weirdness that was happening to him, Izuku would be perfectly fine. Oh, how wrong he was. The next incident occurred at a very inopportune moment right in the center of his house. Izuku was slumped against the table, sorting through his new notebook. There wasn't anything particular about it that differentiated it from any other of the books in his notebook hoard, except that it wasn't a hero notebook this time. Every theory and note, every drawing and diagram, and every last sample and ounce of research, they all pertained to the least likely person that Izuku had believed would ever make the cut in being part of his notebooks, which was Izuku himself. Masaru was immersed in his own work, fixated on a mannequin and all manner of sewing needles at the ready. He was working a deadline on a collaboration with a support company, helping to create stylish and practical costumes for pro heroes. Izuku had cross-referenced every quirk encyclopedia, medical dictionary, and marine biology textbook his school had to offer. Unconsciously, he tightened his fist. Was this a quirk after all? If so, why was he manifesting a quirk when he was nearly 13 and such a crappy one? Was this a freak mutation? Unawares, Izuku was squeezing his hands so hard that, if his nails had been any longer, he would have left crescent-shaped claw marks on his hands. What was wrong? What was wrong? What was wrong with? Crash. The sound of breaking glass tore him from his frenetic thoughts, head swiveling in the direction of his father's workplace. "Oh, come on," came the sound of his father's distressed voice. "Izuku!" Izuku crossed the dining area and made his way to Masaru's workroom in an instant. "Could you clean this mess up for me? I'm nearly finished with this piece, and I want to get it to the support company before Friday." Shards of glass were scattered all across the floor. "Yeah, Dad," Izuku said. "No problem." That side table had been 1.5 meters from his father. Izuku wondered how a steady-footed man such as his dad managed to knock the glass down. Except, Izuku thought while sweeping up the shards of glass, with the way the glass was scattered so far from the stool, it almost looked like it had been blown apart from the inside, as if Kaken had stuck his hand in it and exploded the glass himself. Along with the glass, there was the additional issue of the water's trajectory that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Like the glass, the water had seemingly exploded outwards in a full 360-degree angle. A new thought worked its way into Izuku's mind. What if the water exploded from the glass? Because, at first, he thought it was his imagination playing tricks on him. But, in the second that the water had exploded from the glass, Izuku had felt something in his free hand that had clenched for all it was worth. Like a switch had been lit, he could now sense the same thing all around him in tiny beads, even the ones on the mannequin's jacket. Pupils shrunk to pinpricks, and Izuku blanched at the implications of what had just transpired. That was me, that was me, that was me. Good thing this material is waterproof, otherwise I might have missed the deadline. Masaru had long since returned to his work, attention directed to the hem at the back collar. To be certain, Izuku concentrated with all he had and pulled with the subtlest motion of his fingers. What Izuku received for his efforts were several droplets of water, floating off the top of his hand like there wasn't a care in the world. There were 2 things Izuku learned so far about his quirk, because there was only one logical way to possibly label it. First off, any contact with water made him grow scales on his body. Secondly, he could control liquids, as he had recently and accidentally discovered. With further experimentation, secluded in the safety of his bathroom, Izuku also found that he could control the water's temperature, meaning that he could turn any liquid under his control to either ice or vapor. Only his several attempts at freezing left him dizzy, with vapor and boiling being more of his forte. That might prove very useful in a combat situation someday. Thankfully, his family had yet to discover his current ailment. He didn't want to give them the false hope that he had a quirk that was viable enough for a heroics class. He should have been in bed hours ago, with should have being an operative phrase, and, despite the fact that he was a night owl, he was sure that his mother would wake him up extra early if she caught him awake past midnight. Kaken lay asleep on the bed at the opposite end of the room, the occasional snore being the only noise that filled the room. As he stared out the window, pondering his newfound abilities, Izuku felt as if he had merely breached the surface of what he could do. There had to be more to it than the scales and the water control. Something within his gut screamed this notion. Maybe if he slept on it, the answers would come to him in the morning. The full moon rose into view of his window, filling his shared bedroom with cool, silvery light. Izuku stilled, green eyes widening at the sight. The moon could be so pretty sometimes, Izuku thought, his grip having loosened on the notebook and pencil that fell to the floor. It was so blue and so shiny like the water. Maybe he could even touch it if he got close enough. The idea made him giddy. He had to go to the beach, he had to go to the beach, he had to go to the beach. He had to go there right now. Izuku giggled at the thought. It would be a short while, and it wasn't even a school night anyway. Within minutes, the Bakugo's front door slammed shut, the noise reverberating throughout the house. Minutes later, Mitsuki nudged her husband. "Honey," he groaned but did not respond otherwise. "Masaru, honey." She tried again. "Yes, Mitsuki?" Masaru groggily responded after a minute or two. "I think Izuku's finally reached his rebellious phase." "What makes you say that?" Masaru asked. "Well," she drawled to emphasize her point. "He just left the house at 11:30 at night, laughing like a lunatic. If that isn't teenage rebellion, I don't know what is." "Should we go after him?" Masaru posed the question, newfound concern lacing his tone. "Nah," Mitsuki dismissed. "If you know Izuku, the worst thing he's probably doing is kicking down garbage on Dagoba Beach. What if Katsuki comes through that door with him? Then I'll beat his butt too," the mom stated with finality. "You know what they say, Mitsuki?" Masaru started. "If you love something, let it go." He earned a swat on the head for that comment. "But if it comes back, ground it for the rest of his natural-born life." Pfft. Mitsuki snorted. Masaru always knew how to lighten any situation. "Can you at least give him a talk sometime during the week?" Masaru asked as he pulled the comforter back over his shoulders. "Sure thing, honey," she yawned. If Mitsuki wanted to function properly tomorrow, she'd need to go back to sleep, and so would Masaru. She had full faith that Izuku would be home in the morning, albeit very groggy from his outing whatever it was that he was doing. Mitsuki would make him clean the toilets as a proper punishment. At 5 o'clock in the morning, Izuku woke up to the mounds of trash that comprised Dagoba Beach. A shot of pain lanced through his head, resonating throughout his skull like an incessant gong. He could barely open his eyes through the blinding headache, and everything hurt immensely, all the way down to his toes, but as awareness came back to him, cold fear filled his gut like a mound of lead. He was in so much trouble when he got back home. What exactly was he doing on Dagoba Beach at this hour? Nothing was making sense. The last thing he remembered doing was going through his notes once more before bed, and then, "Kid," a foreign voice interrupted, a shoe prodding at his ribs. It was coming from above him. "Hey kid, what are you doing out at this hour?" Izuku looked up from his position on the hard ground, meeting a pair of sunken blue eyes that regarded him curiously. He was a tall man, dressed in a baggy t-shirt and oversized jeans with yellow hair comparable to a lion's mane. Despite his wiriness, his height made him quite the imposing figure. "You?" Izuku's mouth struggled to find the proper words. What came out sounded more like a question than an answer. I fell asleep here, I think." "Well, you look like you got hit by a bus." Quite blunt, the man was probably correct that Izuku looked like the way he felt. The man offered his hand to Izuku, who gratefully took the proffered appendage. Izuku's legs felt like absolute mush, as if he could fall over at any second. They quivered beneath him, like they were no longer used to holding up the rest of him. The teen nearly fell to the sand where he stood. When he was sure that the kid before him would not fall over, the man moved to look at something over Izuku's shoulder beyond Izuku's own line of vision. He clicked his teeth together in contemplation before asking, "What's your quirk, kid?" Oh. Izuku, startled at the question when it registered in his brain. "Well, you see, Mr. My quirk it's..." The teen averted his eyes and muttered something unintelligible under his breath. "What?" "That I'm quirkless." He finally divulged, and, seeing as he'd been quirkless for the past 12 years of his life, it wasn't like Izuku was lying. Yet, something in the man's eyes seemed to soften at his admission of quirklessness. Luckily for Izuku, he didn't press for further answers. "Then could you tell me who did this?" The gaunt man gestured to the trash heaps a few meters away, except said trash was half covered by numerous, oversized tide pools. It wouldn't have been unusual, seeing that the dump was on a beach. Even at the most extreme high tide, however, the waves could never reach that far. To add to the oddness of the impromptu flash flood, It appeared as if most of the garbage looked like it had been pummeled by several large sledgehammers. Izuku hoped his expression of shock wasn't visible to the man. I really don't know, sir. That was a lot of water. It was a good thing that he said he was quirkless, because if Izuku told this man otherwise, he would probably be inclined to call the police for illegal quirk usage. I don't mean to be rude, but I really should be going home now before my parents and brother start to worry. Before they collectively kill me. Thank you for helping me, Izuku said, adding a polite bow at the end of his sentence. What's your name? It wasn't like Izuku would ever meet the stranger again, right? Who in their right mind would hang out at a makeshift junkyard in the wee hours of the morning? Therefore, Izuku figured that there would be no harm in answering the question. Bakugou. Izuku Bakugou, was the reply that the man received. I'm Yagi Tashinori. The man Yagi introduced in kind. Thanks again for the help, Yagi. Izuku waved as he exited the beach before heading in the direction of his home. He stumbled with every few steps he took, so Tashinori didn't turn back until he was sure Izuku wouldn't trip over his own feet. It wouldn't do the kid any good if he passed out on the streets again. Be safe, kid. At 6 o'clock a.m., Izuku staggered through the front door. Izuku! Greeted his dad, who met Izuku's eyes before returning to his newspaper and coffee. Welcome back. With his dad, Izuku knew that he must have been quite concerned about where he'd been and why he'd been out since last night. Mitsuki was less tactful, giving her own 2 cents from her position at the dining room table in lieu of a proper hello. You look like sheet. And Izuku really couldn't object to that statement. He didn't even have shoes. So instead of making a Kakin-esque retort, he made a sluggish beeline to his room, not caring that he smelled like a mixture of rotten garbage and the large hauls of fish that his parents would bring from the seafood market. Since every last muscle in his body begged for the comfort of his bed, Izuku didn't even bother removing his filthy clothes either and simply pulled the blankets over his body, falling asleep in minutes. If Mitsuki or Masaru suspected that something was strange going on with their youngest son, then they didn't voice it aloud. It was obvious, however, in some of the new habits that he seemed to have picked up overnight that something had changed in their son. For instance, Izuku refused to drink out of anything other than a straw. He avoided bottles, cups, and glasses like the plague. When they thought about it, it wasn't just the drinking water either. Green pleather gloves were the prominent accessory with his school uniform, which he wore at every chance he got. He never washed dishes anymore, which was the usual chore he was tasked with, and did extra, dry chores as an alternative. On one rainy week, Izuku unexpectedly came down with a horrible fever and could not attend school. Mitsuki, having a sibling of her own, knew every trick in the book. Despite the fact that Izuku burned with fever, she smelled a rat, if the fact that he had finished homework with complete cognizance was any indication. His fever lasted until the sun came out. Another aspect of these changes was his suddenly voracious appetite, where nothing was off-limits for Izuku. Rice, meats, and fish were his foods of choice. Izuku had taken a newfound liking for tuna, going so far as to ask for extra helpings of dashi cooked into his katsudon bowls, being high in protein, carbohydrates, and fats. Of course, Mitsuki was a little grateful that Izuku could clean out their leftovers, as she hated it when things went to waste, but now he seemed to out-eat herself, Katsuki, and even Masaru. Last she and Masaru checked, he wasn't involved in any fitness clubs at school or any clubs for that matter. On the other hand, Izuku wasn't gaining any weight either. So where did he even fit all that food? The strangest incident of all was when Katsuki had tipped over a glass of water on a family dinner night, and Izuku bolted to the bathroom like his life depended on it. There was a thud, like he'd fallen to the ground, and a splat from something else. Minutes later, Izuku exited the bathroom, albeit with less coordination in his steps. Briefly, Mitsuki wondered if Katsuki had done that on purpose. Well, if Katsuki also suspected something, the parents didn't even need to ask for him to keep an extra sharp eye on Izuku. Katsuki was older, so Masaru and Mitsuki held him to a standard of responsibility. Plus, they were brothers after all, and brothers look out for one another. Izuku walked back from school, pulling his collar high over his neck. Though nothing was currently there, the area had become quite sensitive to the cold ever since that night, as the teen had effectively dubbed it. In addition, having forgotten his gloves, Izuku's hands felt like ice in the chilly afternoon air. The beach along the walkway was relatively clean, as he was a little far from his house near Dagoba. Nearby was a boardwalk, which would be empty until the nightfall, when recreational fishers came to fish. Sometimes, when he was younger, his dad would take him and Kaken to cast a few lines. Kaken outfished them both. It wouldn't hurt to sit there and listen to the waves for a while, right? Being a constant in his life, Izuku really loved the ocean noises. It was just so peaceful. Besides, Kaken would be coming up this route soon enough. "Hey, Bakugou!" A voice from behind him called, ripping Izuku from his reverie. He stood and turned around, meeting the faces of some kids in his class that he recognized. They were Kaken's friends. One of them was the kid from preschool, the one with the extendable fingers, and the other was one he barely knew. The two wore matching grins, but they weren't friendly at all. What are you doing here, guys?" Izuku kept his voice even, hoping for a simple hello and goodbye. "Kaken's back at the library if you're looking for him." He reached behind his neck. For the project. The last term paper was finished a week ago. Everyone knew it. We just wanted to see how the only quirkless kid can fare. The kid with the fingers started, grin becoming impossibly wide. Without his personal shield. With the sheer amount of times that Kaken had beaten up other students over simply hearing the words quirkless and brother used together in the same sentence at school, it was undeniable. "That's all right. Maybe tomorrow we can spar at the school gym, but I gotta go now." Izuku tried, but he knew it was futile. They were actively seeking a fight against him, having stepped forward to flank either side of Izuku. He looked past the bullies in hope that there was an adult or anybody nearby, but the road was completely vacant. Additionally, there was no feasible way to get past the two bullies unscathed. He was effectively trapped. Theoretically, Izuku could use his newfound abilities. Images of sending a large wave across the dock flashed in his mind. Could he even control that much water? Izuku never tried. But then word of his quirk would get out to others, and whether or not that word got to his family or some overenthusiastic doctors that were hell-bent on examining his freak mutation, the teen did not want to answer anybody's questions. 5 fingers shot at him, and they only missed Izuku by chance. The kid only had a reach of 5 meters before his hands got sore, so, as long as he kept a distance, Izuku would be fine. He was also a lefty, so Izuku also made sure to stay on the other teen's weak side. As for the other kid, what was his quirk again? His answer came in a set of colorful darts that barely missed his face. "Are you crazy?" Izuku shrieked. Another round of poorly aimed darts were his response. Flitting back and forth, green eyes searched for an opening, any feasible opening or some sort of escape. Laughter came from somewhere, but it was drowned out by the panic that clouded every last rational thought process Izuku possessed. "Hey you! Shitfaces!" Another, familiar voice yelled. If the situation weren't so dire, he would have cried in relief. However, at the sound of Kaken's voice, the two didn't stop. Instead, one of them extended his fingers like a wall, permanently closing off any last chance of escape. The other lifted his hands, all 10 fingers pointed in Izuku's direction. Izuku took another step backward as the dark kid's fingertips prepared to fire, completely unaware of how close he was to the pier's end. His heel landed too far past the edge to keep him steady, and Izuku was seaward before he could even register the fact that he was falling. Izuku's last thought within the 10 seconds of breathlessness blared like a foghorn in his mind. He really should have waited for Kaken. "Izuku!" Katsuki charged for the edge of the pier, knocking the 2 extras aside to the ground. Where the hell was that bastard? His hands crackled and popped. He couldn't see anything through the murky water. For a brief moment, Katsuki considered jumping, but there was a riptide not too far from the dock. "You assholes!" He swiveled to the 2 bullies who were currently making their escape. Explosions emanated from his palms. "You realize that if Izuku's dead, you'll be dead too. I don't ever want to see you around this part of the neighborhood ever again. Are we clear?" Before they were out of sight, Katsuki continued. "And don't even so much as look at me or Izuku at school, got that?" The blonde didn't even watch them nod and skitter off like the cowards they were, turning back to the pier. He looked around the shoreline, searching for the curly green hair of his brother. If Izuku was freaking dead, then his parents would kill them both, and then Katsuki would kill Izuku again. If he were Izuku, then he probably would have tried to make for the shoreline. Izuku could SCK at sports, but he was a strong swimmer. Of course, he'd have to swim parallel to the shore so that the current would provide no resistance. Furthermore, there was no way to get up from the water back towards the school, while there was only low, rocky terrain that was easy to climb over back towards their house, so Izuku would have gone left. Katsuki's legs were moving in an instant. Izuku hauled himself up the shore, away from the reach of the waves. Any moment now, Kaken would come looking for him and find him like, "Du." Izuku blanched. "Oh no, oh no, oh no, oh no, oh no. Kaken! Wait!" He could hear the blonde's footsteps getting closer and closer from the large rock he was hiding behind. Why you can't come back here because? Viable excuse, viable excuse. What could he use to deter his stubborn brother? Because I'm naked. Technically, it wasn't a lie. Katsuki instantly halted. Why's? Kaken. My pants were too heavy to wear in the current. I couldn't possibly swim back to shore with them. And then my boxers snagged on a rock. He flopped to the ground in relief, then added as an afterthought, I have some extra pants in my bag though. Said bag was currently sopping wet, along with his current hero journal. Now he'd have to dry his bag too, unless he wanted to repeat this process all over again. At least the notebook about himself was safe and sound in his bedroom. Make your butt decent then. Katsuki growled, turning away from the rock. He hovered his hands over his body and focused on the sensation of heat. The process felt similar to igniting a gaslight stove beneath his skin, but if he put too much effort into it, he'd end up burning himself, which was what Izuku was nearly doing in his haste to dry himself. It was only another 2 minutes before a tingling sensation traveled down his spine, and Izuku could feel his toes once more. Okay, Kaken. Izuku called from behind the rock, forcing his legs to stay upright. However, when Izuku made to step forward, his legs gave out on him, and he tumbled back onto the rocky beach, the only thing holding him up being his hands. Still, he wasn't getting any better at this, as it took him 10 minutes or so to make the short journey. From the bathtub to his bed. Heh! Izuku laughed ruefully, keeping his eyes on the pebbles beneath his hands. He closed his fists around them, letting the tiny rocks slip from his grasp. Looks like I tired myself out dodging them back there. Guess I should work out with you more often, Kaken. Katsuki was watching him but otherwise said nothing. However, Izuku knew that he was probably several dozen colors of furious with a few shades of worry buried somewhere in the mix. It was there, struggling to get up off the ground, that Izuku finally realized the gravity of the situation. If not for his newfound abilities, he could have drowned, he could have died. He couldn't cry. He couldn't cry right now. Izuku tried again to get up on wobbly legs that refused to respond to his commands. A tremor racked through his body, as he tried with all his strength to stand. For the time being, his legs were dead weight. You can't stand. It was a statement without the usual anger that laced his brother's tone, pointing out the obvious. Can you, Izuku? Izuku didn't answer, refusing to admit his weakness in front of his brother. Why couldn't he be more like Kaken sometimes? Strong and sure and confident, his brother was everything that Izuku wasn't. He didn't know how long he remained staring at the ground, allowing the tears to fall from his face, but it wasn't until Kaken heaved him up by the shoulders that Izuku tried to move forward once more. You should be freaking heavier than this with all the shit you've been eating lately. The process of getting back to Dagoba was slow, their feet moving together in mismatched steps. All was quiet, save for the crashing of the waves until Izuku finally spoke. Could you just not tell Mom and Dad about this for now? The blonde stilled, stopping the two in their tracks. Idiot, Katsuki seethed, though he didn't remove his arm from underneath Izuku. When you fell off the pier, you didn't even come up from the water back there. Did you even see the size of the currents? Izuku sniffed, hating how furious Kaken was getting over him. No matter, he couldn't stop his brother from getting louder and louder, his gruff voice drowning out all other sounds. I don't know what kind of shit is going on with you, Deku, But do you freaking understand that you almost died? I know, Kaken. I know. Izuku sobbed, wiping his face with one of his hands. He was glad that his tears didn't have the same effect on him that other liquids did, otherwise his secret would have been exposed long since. I just don't want them to worry about me anymore. For someone who acts like such a smart but all the time, your skull is made out of some seriously thick sheet. The blonde made sure to get the last word. Soon enough, rocky seaside transitioned into sand, before ending with the heaps of trash that were the primary landmarks of Dagoba Beach. The door to the Bakugo household slammed open, earning a shout of displeasure on Mitsuki's behalf. Hey Dad! Izuku waved, untwisting from Katsuki. Briefly, he teetered before standing upright. Shitface here almost died today. Katsuki gestured to his side. Ever so calmly, Masaru set his drink on the table and asked for Katsuki to kindly hand him the telephone after he set Izuku on the couch. The accompanying scream frightened the entirety of the Bakugo household. The following week, the two bullies did not show up for school. In addition, Katsuki was being more of a mother hen than usual. As mother hen-ish as one such as Katsuki Bakugou could be, it was more like an especially vigilant and explosive hawk, because the blonde would definitely anger at such a girlish title. So it was definitely the full moon that caused the loss in consciousness, but what happened in the meantime? Obviously there was a PRD of time before I woke up that I'd done something to trigger the full-scale change, seeing as I can no longer touch water without it happening. My control over water also seemed to increase during that time, if the damage from that one night was any indication. Maybe that Toshinori guy saw something I didn't. I'll ask if I ever see him again. Good thing I didn't use my heating power. Imagine how that could have fluctuated. Otherwise, I could have turned the whole beach into... Izuku! Quit it! Izuku jolted upright, effectively ripped from his tangent. Sometimes he didn't even know when he mumbled. What was he even saying there? Just to be sure though, you didn't happen to hear anything there, did you? I heard that you're a big nerd. The green-haired teen fake pouted at that comment. So, maybe his powers were increased by the moon? That could be something to try. Later in the evening, Izuku lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. For some odd reason, his skin was buzzing with an energy that had kept him restless throughout the day. It had been ignorable at first, but now that it was nighttime, Izuku felt as if he'd burst. Should I test my powers? Izuku thought. Only a half moon was out, but moonlight was moonlight. He could only do so much while locked in the bathroom, since narrow walls and a simple tub did meager justice. Don't you even think about leaving this room, Izuku? Katsuki said from his own bed, voice muffled by the covers. Izuku just stared, stunned silent, before slowly lowering himself back onto his pillow. I didn't lug your sorry but home for you to start pulling more of your sheet again. If Izuku even so much as moved, Katsuki would certainly wake up again, which was why it was another 2 hours before he carefully slinked from his bed. His socks made no sound on the hardwood floor, so it was an easy task for Izuku to close the distance between his bedroom and the front door. Halfway down the street, Izuku regretted not taking a pair of shoes, but if he turned back now, he'd likely get caught for sneaking outside again. Plus, he would only be gone for an hour or two at best. The neighborhood at the foot of the beach was normally dead silent at this hour, so the streets were just as empty. Piles of trash that marked the edge of Dagoba Beach loomed like dark figures overhead. With their height and bulk, they would successfully hide what Izuku would be doing. Had it been daytime, Izuku could have taken the small opening through the trash that was visible in the light, but, because it was dark, the fastest path to the water would be to climb across the refuse, as opposed to feeling around blindly for the passageway of trash. Metal somethings banged and clattered as he cleared the top of a washer, and he flinched at the resulting noise it made. Even though no one visited the beach but him anymore, Izuku was still wary of potential witnesses. Eventually, Izuku made it to the shoreline. Slightly out of breath from the climb, his exhales fogged in the chilly darkness. Kaken was right. He definitely needed some resistance training when he got the chance. No matter, it was time to do what he came here for in the first place. Holding out his hand to the water, Izuku concentrated on the push-pull sensation of the water. He reeled his arm back, taking a sizable globe of seawater towards him. In a way, it was similar to the bathtub in the ease of which he could feel the liquid. Unlike the bathtub, which was confined to a small and generalized space, Izuku had to put a little extra effort into pulling it from the sea's vast and ever-moving waves. It hovered beside him innocuously, simply stagnating in the air, and Izuku would have been inclined to touch it, if not for the result that would ensue. The action took very little out of him, in fact. Again, he repeated the process, reaching and pulling out more liquid that he did the first time, about enough to fill a rather large, inflatable pool if he had to guess. Izuku kept pulling more and more water from the sea until he had about a dozen large balls of water hovering around him anymore, and it would be too conspicuous to continue. After a moment's thought, he pointed at one, opening his hand, and tightly squeezed it into a fist. Instantaneously, the targeted globe dispersed into steam. Taking control of more of his seawater, Izuku experimentally moved his arms around in a circle, letting two of the globes coalesce into one large sphere that spiraled in the air with the circular motions. He stilled, and so did the globes. Attention shifting to a large refrigerator in his line of vision, Izuku gathered the rest of the water under his control, bringing it over his head. With all the force he could muster, he moved his hands forward. When the water cleared, what was left in place of the former fridge was a rather large hunk of scrap metal. Unbeknownst to Izuku, someone had been watching his practice. Gleaming blue eyes widened in surprise and fascination as the kid they'd been acquainted with some time ago pulled globe after globe of water from the sea and then launched it at the nearest unsuspecting piece of trash. So it had been the kid, after all. Bakugou Izuku, Yagi recalled, that had flooded and demolished the trash that one night. But why had he felt the need to lie about his quirk? Yagi wondered. Perhaps he didn't want to get in trouble for using his quirk in public, but, then again, the kid seemed quite earnest about his answer. Yagi would have to ask him about it the next time they met. Izuku whooped in triumph at the washing machine he'd reduced to rubble. He couldn't fight the grin that spread on his face the more he used his power. Kids never manifested their quirks this late in life, and Izuku had been formally diagnosed as quirkless, yet here he was, moving water around with ease. Really, it was child's play. He didn't head home until the sun was just about peeking up from the horizon, and even with he thought of being grounded, the teen couldn't shake the skip out of his step. When Izuku stepped into his house, thankfully, no one was up yet, not even his mom. After slipping into a fresh All Might-themed t-shirt and flopping straight onto his bed, he felt more content than he had in weeks. Izuku showed up to the beach several more times, though he always seemed to leave before Yagi could get a word in with him. His absence was usually preceded by another loud, blonde-haired teen who'd hunt for him as Izuku made his escape. A bully, perhaps? About a month and a half later, however, Izuku showed up as per routine, but something was off about him. As if a switch had been flipped, his typical calm demeanor had been replaced with something sporadic and unhinged. The sound of manic laughter echoed through the night, as Izuku lifted up a much larger army of globes than he usually did, before launching them at whatever trash was in his line of sight. Yagi didn't disapprove of disposing trash, but the amount of force that Izuku was currently using was excessive. He also couldn't help but frown at the string of profanities that was directed towards said trash. With the power of one for all at the ready, the older man was ready to intervene before Izuku ended up injuring someone else or himself. It appeared that it was unnecessary when the kid became stock still. Toshinori sighed in relief, thinking that Izuku had finally exhausted himself. Without warning, though, the teen launched himself towards the edge of the beach, taking a nosedive straight into the cold sea. Blood sprayed from his mouth in absolute shock. That kid had to be on some sort of drags or something to have jumped like that. Inflating into his hero form, All Might, Toshinori made to jump in after him. When the tide suddenly grew to a very unnatural height, Toshinori swore in English, watching as the wave grew to a ridiculous size. If the kid really wasn't as right in the head as he initially believed, then Yagi would need to stop him before he did something he regretted. There was a whole neighborhood behind them, so, if that tidal wave were launched at something other than trash, the resulting damage would be devastating. He'd have to be careful because if the kid was still alive and making giant tidal waves, then Toshinori would have to be cautious on how powerful his next Texas smash would be. Blue eyes scanned the dark waters, searching for anything, any sort of movement. A vaguely humanoid silhouette flashed in the dead center of the wave. The Texas smash. Tashinori punched the air, allowed the wave to disperse, and leapt into the air to catch the figure that was falling to the ground. After lowering his catch to the sand, Tashinori reeled backwards in shock. What he caught was definitely the kid, but not completely, at least. Undoubtedly, it was the Bakugo boy. What was beached on the sand, however, was no longer a regular-looking teenager, but an amalgamation of a boy and a fish. Where a normal human boy had been, scales and fins were now in place of clothes and shoes. As for the kid's legs, they were currently melded into a large, fishy tail. Kaken should see me now, he giggled, tail fin flapping madly against the sand. Then he pushed himself up, as if he were trying to stand on two legs that weren't there, before flopping back down onto the beach. I need a medic. I've fallen and I can't get up. Carefully, Tashinori took slow and cautious steps towards Izuku. Something crunched underfoot. The resulting sound caused a set of emerald black eyes to zero in on their target, and Izuku raised a webbed hand. An intense wave of heat overcame Tashinori, and he swore in realization. Even in this state of his, the kid still retained some semblance of his intelligence and creativity. The kid was literally boiling his blood for crying out loud. Vaguely, Tashinori thought he heard him yell something about stranger danger. No matter, he needed to stop the Bakugou kid once more. With an ultralight karate chop or two, Izuku was out cold. Tashinori took that as his own cue to power down, plopping down onto the sand beside the fish kid? Mare boy? He'd seen many fascinating aquatic quirks from pro heroes during his own hero career, but this one was a first in the blonde man's experience. What triggered his transformation? Tashinori wondered. Was it the water? Because the kid had been dry for a good 45 minutes, and nothing was happening. It was a good thing that he had been the one to find the Bakugou boy, rather than the police, who would most definitely give the kid a very stern talking to when he came to his senses. It would be best to keep watch over the kid in case something else were to happen. The sun was beginning to rise over the horizon several hours into Tashinori's vigil over the strange kid. He was just about ready to fall asleep himself, when a flash roused him from his near slumber. He hadn't even turned back to the kid when he'd returned to normal. All fishy features had disappeared, scales, tail, and all. Tentatively, Tashinori lifted an eyelid, finding normal, green eyes instead of the manic emerald that had stared at him from the sand. DKU. Another voice shouted, who Tashinori also recognized. It was the ash blonde that always seemed to chase Izuku off the beach every chance that he got. Iwa. Kaken. The angry shout startled Izuku from his slumber and into a sitting position, and he whipped around to meet the even angrier face of his brother. Where the frig were you? You, the teen stammered. Aye. Spit it out, sheet for brains, because I'm going to be the least of your worries today. A whimper was the blonde's only reply. I was. Izuku racked his addled brain for any feasible excuse, anything to shut up Kaken. But his older brother was too keen to believe anything that Izuku would come up with in the next 30 seconds. You see, Kaken, I was actually out here because his legs quivered beneath him more than they usually did. He could barely think through the fog in his brain. Because I was cleaning the beach. Yagi finally interrupted. Both teens turned to the speaker, one of them staring in recognition. What? Katsuki said, dumbfounded at the gaunt man that was making his way towards them. He didn't like the presence of the creepy newcomer at all. This young man helped me clean the beach last night, and so I came back here to thank him for a job well done. Isn't that correct, Bakugou? Why, yeah. Izuku agreed, going along with Tashinori's lie. There was clear relief in his baggy green eyes. Then Tashinori turned to the newcomer with a look of stern disapproval, the one that kept chasing after Izuku. And who are you to be yelling at this boy? The seething and affronted look that was sent Tashinori's way could have set a house on fire. I'm his older brother. Now why were you cleaning this crappy beach anyhow, Izuku? Said teen gave a thoughtful hum before responding. Well, Izuku started, bringing a hand up to his chin. You know how much we used to love this place, Kaken. I'm not sure if you still do or what, so I wanted to clean it up a little and then he averted his eyes to anywhere other than Katsuki. Then I thought we could bring Mom and Dad here so they could enjoy it again, 'cause they liked it too. Katsuki grit his teeth, but the anger in his eyes had faded for the most part. Can't you leave this kind of shit to the people with quirks? You're not going to get into a hero course by breaking all your bones first. Sorry, Kaken. Izuku apologized. It's just that I thought I could do something nice for everyone for once. Are you coming or what? Katsuki would have stomped off, but Izuku refused to move from his seat on the ground. Izuku's face turned crimson, embarrassment apparent on his features. I can't walk right now. A huff and an eye roll later, and Izuku was pulled into a fireman's carry with an indignant squawk. Toshinori waved his goodbyes as Katsuki carried Izuku from the beach, but not before meeting the questioning green eyes of the youngest Bakugou. In due time, they would both get their answers. Mom, Dad, Kaken, Izuku began with the utmost confidence. I have a quirk. The bathroom mirror said nothing back, only showing a red-faced Izuku, who hovered a few beads of water over his fingertips. He had spoken the same line into the mirror for what felt like the 100th time, throat tightening at the imminent uproar that would ensue at that simple phrase. Izuku hadn't even considered telling anyone in his family until that day with the bullies, hoping that whatever he had thought was wrong with him would eventually blow over. In all honesty, Izuku should have told them when it all began when the scales had first started to appear. But then his dad would be fussing over him, his mom would call every doctor under the sun, and Kaken would yell at him for even thinking of hiding his condition in the first place. Everyone would needlessly worry over him like they always did. With a motion of his fingers, he sent the water back into the sink. This was hopeless. He really needed some fresh air. Amid the stress that Izuku had been feeling lately, an idea settled like a seed in his mind. It increased the sensation of tingly restlessness that had been ever buzzing beneath his skin. Izuku suspected a remedy, as there was only so much relief he could get out of simply moving globes of water around. His mom was working late, and his dad was out of town on business for at least another week or two. They wouldn't even know he was out late again. Of course, there was also Kaken, but his brother had been sleeping much easier after that encounter with Yagi on Dagoba Beach, since he figured that Izuku wasn't doing anything dangerous in his free time. Izuku still wanted to know why the gaunt man had covered for him. Had Yagi seen him? Izuku shoved the thought from his mind. It was best not to think about that with 1,000 other worries on his plate. Nothing bad would happen, plus he'd be in full cognizance. Izuku reassured himself. It would also be a great opportunity to test the waters, no pun intended, in his other form. Plus, if he wanted to be a hero, then he would have to be able to use all of his abilities to their fullest extent. A swim was definitely in order. Remembering to slip on his favorite red shoes and pocketing a spare key, Izuku made it to the edge of the beach before the watch upon his wrist struck 10. After hanging his shoes on a rather tall piece of trash, Izuku carefully slid down an indiscernible square of metal, feet landing on a very small outcropping. Dagoba Beach's dark current twisted and roiled below him. Green hair fell into his face as he leaned forward and tried to stare through the murky depths. Looking closely enough, Izuku could see the bright crescent moon and stars mirrored in the water and even a little of his own reflection. It was mystifying and calming at the same time. It wasn't that far of a drop, about 1.75 meters if he had to estimate, but something unsettled Izuku about being in a body of water that wasn't his bathtub. The idea of swimming out further and further into the sea felt foreign to him. What if he swam too deep beneath the waves, never to emerge? Or what if he swam so far out that he got lost and never found his way back to shore? However, if he were to master this quirk of his and eventually become a hero, Izuku knew that he shouldn't hesitate like he was doing just now. Some of the things he was thinking were too irrational. This time, with no moon, no bullies, and nothing to stop him, Izuku leapt into the waters, letting the icy current envelop him. Izuku remained calm in the dark waters, making the count to 10, and a shock like lightning shot up his spine, all the way down to the tips of his toes. Clothes faded into glistening black scales, blossoming down his arms and across his face. Webbing grew in between his fingers and where human ears had been, while fins simultaneously sprouted in various places such as his wrists and back. His spine shifted and elongated as his legs morphed together into something more powerful, more seaworthy, leaving a large, fanning tail fin in their wake. The transformation had only taken the span of a second, but in the moment between humanity and something else it felt as if time had stopped for Izuku. He blinked once, then twice, allowing his eyes to readjust to the water. Now he could see everything down to the nearest seashell like it was broad daylight. 6 gills opened and closed at his neck, and Izuku almost gagged from the water quality, which he figured was from the pollution. Nonetheless, he pumped his tail fin, the motion slow and awkward from little use. It was a tedious endeavor for the first few minutes. However, the more he moved through the water, the more confident Izuku became as he swam. Faster and faster, the undersea terrain passed by in a blur. Izuku felt like a bullet. Soon enough, hesitation melted into exuberance, delighted whoops and hollers, leaving behind nothing but bubbles as he twisted and spun beneath the waves. He wasn't flying, but at the speed he was going, it felt close to it. Why had he ever been scared of this in the first place? With the first conscious transformation having occurred in the privacy of his home, luckily alone, it had left Izuku shaken. For a long while afterwards, even the mere thought of transforming or so much as even looking at stray liquids made him queasy. Why hadn't he done this sooner? Breaking through the water, Izuku stared in wonder at the shore before him. Unaware of his swimming prowess, he had made it a good 1.5 kilometers from the shoreline. At his position far, far away from the bright city lights, the sight of the night sky made him gape, where stars framed Muzutafu like little diamonds. All along, Izuku had been craving this freedom. Not only could he see the shores of Dagoba Beach and beyond, but, if he squinted, he could see the rooftop of his home. His mom would be home any minute now. Letting out a slew of very Kaken-like words, Izuku slipped beneath the waters once more, tail fin pumping behind him. Wiry arms found great difficulty in hauling the bulk of his body upward and onto the shore. Of course, getting back home would be the real ordeal, but Izuku would need to get out of the water first and foremost. He had almost cleared his tail completely from the water, when a piece of metal that protruded from the water grazed the area directly above his tail fin. Izuku hissed in pain, but immediately went to drying himself instead of looking at the large scrape that had formed. He would need to clean that later, unless he wanted the cut to get infected. It couldn't possibly get any worse, Izuku miserably thought, stumbling home from Dagoba Beach. Not only did his left leg have a sizable, bleeding cut, but someone had stolen his shoes right from where he'd left them. Those were his favorite shoes. When he all but collapsed against the doorframe, he felt around his pocket in a frenzy, nearly thinking that the key would not be there by some chance. He probably looked like he'd been through a lawnmower, Izuku supposed, if the matching, displeased glares from Kaken and his mom were anything to go by. Before he stumbled through the door, the two had been sitting at the table, awaiting the return of the youngest Bakugou. Mitsuki didn't miss a beat. "Where the frig were you?" Izuku didn't respond, the last of his energy exhausted from the walk home. "Say something, you little sheet." Kaken shouted at him, slamming one of his fists on the table. In the other was a pair of red shoes. Oh, so that's where they went. Rather than standing stock still in the doorway, he staggered forwards once again in the direction of his bedroom. "I had to go looking for you at 12 o'clock at night, while Mom was here worrying over your sorry butt. Do you even care anymore, or do you want us to find you in a ditch?" He could barely hear Kaken's enraged yelling, his hearing oddly muffled by something. Maybe he'd just sleep it off and deal with it in the morning. Frig. Mitsuki's eyes widened when she caught the trail of blood left in the foyer. "You're bleeding." "Wah," said Izuku, his mouth having struggled to form the response. Only now did he register the fact that his left leg still gushed with blood. How much blood did he lose? He looked behind him, following the sizable trail of red back to his injured leg, even when the dining room began to tilt. "He's not all." Chairs squeaked and clattered, and suddenly a pair of arms were holding him up. "Gee, so water, Mom." "Water? No. It was like someone had injected Izuku with a double dose of adrenaline. Without warning, he was bucking and thrashing in the arms that held him. "No!" he gasped, struggling to escape from his captor's hold. Katsuki only tightened his grasp. Somewhere within the haze of his vision was the blurry figure of his mom, who held the insidious towel that Kaken had ordered her to retrieve. The water dripped onto the floor, signifying his impending doom. I can't." Izuku's arm shot back, and elbow met bone. He couldn't let them touch him. "Why you guys can't?" Izuku reeled his elbow back once more, hitting flesh, and the arms that encircled him released Izuku from their hold. "Don't you touch me!" With one final burst of strength, he sprung up from the floor, then staggered to the bathroom like his life depended on it. The door slammed shut with several locking mechanisms being clicked into place, leaving nothing but dead silence as the aftermath. It was Katsuki's and Mitsuki's turn to gape at the door that had been shut in their faces. What was wrong with Izuku? And it wasn't just the injury or the blood loss that both of them suspected was happening. When Mitsuki came to clean his injury, Izuku's eyes had been wild and fearful. Right now, Mitsuki could let Katsuki break through the door with either picks or explosions. She'd take the former, "Thank you very much." But Izuku didn't tick in the same way as Katsuki, so Mitsuki knew that the intimidation tactics that she would much rather use would be a moot point on her sensitive son. Although she would rather force it out of him, in this delicate state of his, Mitsuki had a feeling that it was better to leave her son be with his thoughts. And his blood loss. Her mind added. Izuku would likely be alive and well the next day, hopefully in a better mood and in a more cognizant state than right now. Besides, he could take care of himself. Izuku was hurting both inside and out. Even as he filled up the tub with hot water and let his tail fin stretch to its full length, the cut continued to sear with pain. Izuku hissed as the water made contact with his tail, and he gritted his teeth until the initial bout of pain receded. With the heat of the water taking every last bit of tension from his muscles, Izuku could very well fall to sleep where he was. The bleeding had stopped a good 10 minutes ago, and he really wanted to forget what he had done. Hurting his brother and frightening his mom, Izuku felt the heavy pang of guilt course through his veins. He would have to apologize for that later. Sinking further into the bathwater, Izuku closed his eyes, letting exhaustion overtake him. "Mom? Kaken?" Izuku called to the door, about an hour or so after he'd finally awakened. The house was silent, and he probably slept until noon, if he had to guess from the angle of the bright light streaming into the bathroom. Despite having a good night's rest, exhaustion permeated Izuku's bones like a long-lasting poison. He shifted in the tub, the water's warmth having long since become room temperature during Izuku's extended slumber. Thankfully, the cut on his tail had closed, as there was only a little trail of dried red that ran down the side of the bathtub, but it was evident that the scrape still had a long way to go in terms of healing. There was also another issue, one that couldn't be rectified unless he exited the bathroom. Izuku's stomach growled. He was quite hungry, and his leg would take much longer to heal if there were no nutrients in his system. The extra calories would also compensate for the blood loss that had surely happened last night. Draining the filthy water from the bathtub and pouring some disinfectant on his tail, he waited for the medication to seep into the wound until he was ready to dry himself. With a swift motion of his hands, the liquid that encompassed both Izuku and the tile floor were sent down the drain. Then he redirected his own power to himself, relishing in the feeling of dry heat. Having been in his aquatic form for so long, Izuku lacked the coordination to tiptoe into the kitchen. It didn't matter, since no one was home at this hour anyways. Nonetheless, the short trip from the bathroom to the kitchen consisted of him falling forwards and grabbing onto whatever was sturdy enough to support him until he finally reached the refrigerator. He grabbed several plastic containers filled with all manners of foodstuffs and a bottle of cold water before trudging back into the bathroom on wobbly legs. Izuku frowned, suddenly more aware of the fact that he would be missing school today and perhaps the day afterwards. When he was satisfied with his haul, he made his way back to the bathroom, being careful not to bump his injured leg against anything. After making sure that the door was locked twice over, he refilled the tub with hot water, let the transformation overtake him, and dug into the first container that he could get. 2 hours later saw Katsuki walking through the front door. He was still sad after the stunt Izuku had pulled, ready to blow open the bathroom door with fists or explosions and shake the crazy out of him, but then his mom would imminently take the money right out of his bank account to pay for that door and Izuku's medical bills, of course. Opening the fridge, the blonde found that it was barren. Nothing but a few vegetables, a tub of yogurt, and some indiscernible mush that must have been over a week old remained. Izuku must have been out of the bathroom sometime before he came home, and he took everything: rice, meats, leftovers. Katsuki had to fight back a grimace when he realized that the entitled brat even stole the gallon-sized pot of dashi that was used for cooking purposes. When that little sheet came out, he was going to. "Kaken!" The timid voice of Izuku called from the bathroom, interrupting Katsuki's internal rage. Izuku must look like a freaking prune right now if he was staying in the bathtub all day. "I know you're going to beat the crap out of me when I come out of the bathroom." "Darn right." Katsuki harumphed. At Izuku's spluttering, he allowed himself a small smirk. "You just called me over here so I'd bring you more food, didn't you?" "No. No," defended Izuku, who Katsuki could hear floundering his arms against the bathtub. "Called it. It's not just that, even though I am pretty hungry right now. I kind of wanted to apologize for last night. It's just, the blood loss kinda got to me, and I was really out of it, you know that? That doesn't explain some of the other weird shit you've been doing," Katsuki flat out said. "Like the way you've been acting all secretive lately, spending all your free time at that skanky beach, and disappearing at night. Who do you think you are?" "I know, Kaken. It's really complicated right now," Izuku defended, and Katsuki could hear the shaking that coated his voice. "Is Mom okay though?" she said. Katsuki simply stated, and it was a well-known fact between the two brothers that their mom on a warpath was an unstoppable force. "But she also the reason I'm not blowing the walls apart to strangle you right now." The bathwater sloshed from behind the door. Izuku had another thing coming if he thought he'd leave the bathroom drenched. "By the way, you better have that bathroom sparkling when you finally get your sorry butt together." Fine. Izuku quickly placated. "I will. I promise, Kaken." "So do we still have any of those tuna flakes left? How can he even eat this trash straight up?" Katsuki fumed as he rifled through the pantry, grabbing the dried tuna. Some of the stuff he's been doing lately is just frigged. He should have exploded those flakes right on the spot, just to garner a reaction from Izuku, but the last, microscopic ounce of conscience that Katsuki still retained kept him from doing so. The things he did for his a-hole of a brother. "I got your disgusting tuna sheet." And Katsuki threw the bags at the door, which harmlessly fell to the ground. It was when Izuku didn't retrieve them that Katsuki got impatient. "Well, are you gonna get your food, or am I going to have to explode it first? Could you not look, please?" Izuku requested. "Like I'd ever want to see your naked butt." Katsuki turned away from the bathroom, crossing his arms displeasedly. "Princess much?" He didn't even have to look to know that he'd gotten a rise out of Izuku. There was a set of clicks, some crinkling, and another round of clicks, before the wooden door was shut once more. "2 bags. Thank you so much, Kaken." Izuku's voice was sickeningly grateful. It almost made him feel bad for wanting to beat the ever-living crap out of him. That was 4 liters worth of katsuobushi flakes. 4 liters. He'd give Izuku another few hours before the giant, gaping hole in his gut demanded more sustenance. And then he'd have to come out. "Oh, Kaken." Izuku's voice rang throughout the hallway, causing Katsuki to stop in his tracks yet again. "I almost forgot. I'm also sorry for elbowing you last night. You're not hurt too bad, right? Do I look like a weakling to you, Izuku? I'll accept your apology when you kindly get your head out of the lump of shit you've been eating, and tell Mom and Dad what's going on." It was as close to a yes as was expected from someone as explosive as Katsuki, leaving Izuku satisfied enough to eat his tuna flakes without any further guilt for the time being. True to Katsuki's intuition, it was just after Mitsuki returned from work that Izuku finally emerged from the bathroom. Although he still wore the same outfit that he had been wearing after last night's debacle, his left leg was neatly wrapped in bandages. One leg awkwardly stepped forward, the other shaking behind him, and he was clutching the doorframe that separated the hallway from the rest of the house like a lifeline. Mitsuki closed the distance, catching her son in a hug, and Izuku let his legs go limp, sinking into the affectionate gesture. It was a while before Mitsuki finally released Izuku from the hug. Then she slapped him on the head, causing her son to topple over. "Oh, Mom!" came Izuku's indignant voice from the floor. "What was that for?" "For acting like a complete and total but last night." Right now, Mitsuki could yell at him, shake him by the shoulders, and scream at Izuku for all he was worth for what he had done the previous night. Deciding against the notion, she instead turned to the kitchen, the sight of the barren stovetop setting off another pang of annoyance. "Did either of you even make dinner?" "About that," Izuku said sheepishly, wiping what he thought was a stray crumb off of his shoulder while his mom wasn't looking. The glare from Katsuki told her everything that Mitsuki needed to know. The glutton. Katsuki was predictable. Mitsuki could read him like an open book. Izuku, even with his tumultuous emotions, could be so reclusive sometimes. She didn't know how long it would take, but it was certain that, eventually, Izuku would fess up and tell them what was the matter with him, no matter how withdrawn he had been acting lately. After the debacle with the bathroom and the blood loss, no one pressed Izuku for any more answers, unless they wanted for him to further alienate himself from the rest of the family. Despite the fragile peace in the Bakugo household, Izuku kept to his room for most of his free time after school, which was why, the next time Izuku left for Dagoba Beach, neither Katsuki nor Mitsuki made to stop him. It was only 2 weeks later when Toshinori met the strange boy on Dagoba Beach once more. He was turned to the ocean, guiding a sphere of water around with his hands in calm circles. It was a low tide, so, as opposed to seeing the usual roiling waves that crashed against the shoreline, the sea met sand in languid ripples. Now or never, Toshinori supposed, if he finally wanted to get a word in with Izuku. Even though he doubted it, it was also a good idea to ask in case the boy happened to have met a certain purveyor of quirks. "I thought you said you were quirkless, boy," was the first sentence that left Toshinori's mouth, as he stepped out from his usual hiding place among the rubble. "Yagi-san." Izuku lost focus the instant he recognized the gangly silhouette, and the water he had been holding fell unceremoniously to the ground. He jumped back to avoid the resulting splatter. What are you doing here?" Yagi's lack of response set Izuku on edge. Actually, since the debacle with the cut and his mom and Kaken, everything set him on edge lately. "Were you watching me?" At this point, Izuku was ready to bolt, and whether he'd flee by land or by sea, he had more than enough escape routes to spare. His body was nearly positioned to do a running jump into the ocean, when a firm hand stopped him from doing so. "Relax. Can't you see how low the tide is, kid?" Izuku squinted through the darkness, clearly seeing brown sand beneath the waves. Yagi was right. Izuku had nearly been out of his mind. When Toshinori was certain that Izuku wouldn't try any other risky stunts, he released his hold on the boy. "Thankfully, he didn't move. Be glad I found you that one time, 'cause anyone else would have called the cops or even the pro-heroes." "Pro-heroes?" Izuku squeaked, slightly more fretful of what he'd done during the nights that he'd seen the full moon. After calming down a fraction, the implications of what the gaunt man beside him had just said finally registered in his brain. "So you did see me then?" Izuku didn't even need to see Toshinori's confirming nod to know that he was right. "Well, at least the damage has been allocated to the beach so far." "Yeah." Toshinori brought a hand up to his neck, recalling their short-lived battle. The blonde didn't want to refute Izuku's statement, lest even more questions were raised. "You were quite out of it that night. What happened back there?" "Well," the teen started, unsure of how to proceed. He brought a hand to his chin in thought. "I think it has something to do with my quirk." It sounded strange to Izuku, a formerly quirkless teen, to refer to his abilities as such after 12 years of quirklessness. When I look at the full moon, I lose consciousness, and, as you said, I wasn't really myself, Mr. Yagi." Suddenly, Izuku remembered having lied to Yagi the following day after that one night, when he woke up to heaps of battered and flooded trash. The teen asked his next question with much caution. "You're not going to call the police on me or anything, are you?" A long, misty breath was released into the air. "Tell me I wasn't that bad. Just be careful to stay out of the full moon from now on." He dismissed. Now Tashinori wasn't too sure on laws regarding quirks that were out of their user's control. That was something that he left to his good friend and detective, Naomasa, but he knew that Izuku could have been reported at best and arrested at worst if anyone else had seen him. On the other hand, if a tree fell in the forest and no one was around to catch it, then did the tree really make a sound? No harm, no foul, Yagi supposed. A gust of wind came through the junkyard, blowing Tashinori's hair backwards. It wasn't even winter yet, and already the nights were this cold? Good thing he brought a jacket, because it was probably about 4 degrees right now. As for Izuku, he only wore a t-shirt and sweatpants, which were not meant for this type of weather at all. Sheesh, aren't you cold right now? And no, actually. Are you? His head was tilted in confusion, like Tashinori had said something funny to him. Then his face lit up with realization, as if remembering something very important. Oh, right. I can also heat water, and since the human body is 2/3 water, I can use my powers to keep myself warm. Izuku paused and looked to Yagi, yet another thing finally occurring to him. Wait a second, you must be freezing. Without even thinking, Izuku lifted a hand towards Tashinori with a slight turn of his wrist, triggering the gaslight sensation of his power. Almost instantly, the man felt much warmer, like he had just drank an entire mug of hot tea. Thanks. Have you ever thought of going into hero work, kid? Asked Tashinori, seemingly out of nowhere. In Tashinori's opinion, if the kid ever planned to go into a hero course later in life, the teen definitely showed potential. He appeared to have the will and the power, so only thing he lacked was strength as of yet. Yet ever since I was little. Green eyes were suddenly filled with a light that hadn't been there before. Rescue or combat? Tashinori inquired. Izuku's quirk, such a versatile one, would definitely be suitable for many different kinds of situations. It doesn't matter to me, as long as I can save lots of people with a smile on my face. An all-might fan, Tashinori mused to himself, and the red, yellow, and blue t-shirt that he hadn't initially noticed in the dark should have been his first clue. Everybody was a fan of his hero form these days, Tashinori supposed. Why the secrecy though? Izuku raised an eyebrow, waiting for Yagi to clarify. It seems to me like you have a very powerful quirk, but your brother was talking to you like you didn't even have one. Why are you hiding it from your family, kid? Yasen, Izuku supposed that he owed it to this man's stranger or acquaintance that had covered for him on the beach after Kaken had found him. If not for Yagi, Izuku's secret would have been outed on the beach that day. To tell you the truth, I haven't really had this quirk my entire life. Even though Izuku could not quite put his finger on it, there was something vaguely familiar about Yagi. It made the blonde man feel trustworthy. One day I woke up and found that I was different. It was kind of scary to see myself that way for a while because I had been quirkless for the past 12 years, but when nothing was going away, I kind of hid it without realizing. Maybe it's because I'm the youngest and my mom, dad, and brother baby me a lot that I decided I didn't want them to worry, but I still am, I think, worrying them, that is. Kid Bakugou. Tashinori finally said, pangs of bittersweetness bubbling up in his chest as memories of his own mentor and even his former teacher flashed in his mind of when he'd first gotten his power. Even when he proved himself able to handle the full strength of One for All, they still fussed over him like he was a child who just manifested his own quirk. In my honest opinion, I think that even if they did know, your brother and your parents still would worry. It's a pretty big deal to them when they see you doing things that you couldn't do before, so they will treat you a little differently at first. I guess a quirk is a big change after all. Izuku conceded. He remembered how his mom and dad were always chasing Kaken after he got his quirk, telling them when and where he could use his power and giving him lectures on just how dangerous his quirk could be. And most of the kids with quirks got quirk counseling at one point in their lives. So, are you saying I should tell them, Yagi-san? Tashinori wasn't very good at advice, but the Bakugou kid really seemed like he needed the help. Besides, he had a feeling that everything would turn out fine for Izuku. It's not up to me to make the call, kid, but a quirk isn't really something to hide. So it's up to you on whether or not you're ready. Izuku mulled over Tashinori's words for a long while, and the older man thought Izuku had drifted off, until he finally spoke. You're right. Thank you, Yagi-san. It was a rare occasion for Toshinori to be commended for something outside of his hero persona, the scraggly form that he typically wore being a repellent to most civilians, so he couldn't help the happy glow of accomplishment that warmed him just as much as Izuku's power. You don't need to thank me. Just keep cleaning the beach from time to time. The older of the two responded with a look of mirth in his eyes, and he gave a hearty laugh, spewing blood on the front of his jacket. Iya. Yagi. Forgot about that. Oops. When Izuku realized that Yagi wasn't dying and was thoroughly convinced that the blonde man did not need a trip to the ICU, Toshinori started again. By the way, call me Toshinori instead. Yagi sounds like an old person's name. I'm Izuku then. Masaru Bakugou returned home from business 2 days ahead of schedule. After a cryptic text from Mitsuki, an enraged text from Katsuki, and another cryptic, yet apologetic text from Izuku, he couldn't help but immerse himself in his work as much as possible, completing it in record time. Luckily, there were no more meetings for the remainder of his trip, so, after he had finished the remaining pieces for the support company, the fashion designer was on the next train back to Mizudafu. When he came through the door, his wife and Katsuki were at their respective seats, acting like there was not a care in the world, a sharp contrast to the series of texts that he had received on his phone. Masaru couldn't help but scratch his head in puzzlement. The only normalcy was Mitsuki springing up from her seat to greet him and a gruff nod from Katsuki. But where was Izuku? Hey Dad. Izuku greeted much too calmly. Could you get everybody into the living room for me? I have something that I've been needing get off my chest. I'll be there in a minute. Masaru looked slightly confused at his request but went with it anyway. Sure thing, Izuku. And Masaru turned back to the dining room. Green eyes were grim, carrying the weight of the past 3 months, although Izuku kept a smile in place for his family's sake. He might have changed a great deal on the outside, but, despite everything that had happened, he loved his family more than anything in the world. Fighting past the trepidation and stepping into the living room, Izuku Bakugou greeted his family with a wave, while the other hand clutched an uncapped bottle of water. Mom, Dad, Kaken. He started, ready to call his power at a moment's notice. There's something I need to tell you. Mom, Dad, Kaken. Izuku began, trying to mask the trepidation in his voice with a smile. There's something I need to tell you. All heads in the room were looking his way, and Izuku had to fight to keep himself rooted in place when the room became several degrees hotter at the onslaught of attention. His hands had begun to shake too, and Izuku had to put the bottle he'd been holding on the nearest side table, lest his trembling hands spill water on him prematurely. If he really wanted to, he could turn back now, dismiss his family, and continue to hide his powers until the secret would imminently out itself. Yet, if his secret were discovered any other way, it would be a considered slap in the face by everyone that sat before him. Because he loved his family, Izuku knew that he would have to tell them everything. You know how I've been kind of different lately? The rest of the Bakugou clan perked up at Izuku's words. I'm not really sure where to start. I guess I should say that I'm sorry for worrying you all, sneaking off at night, and hitting Kaken. And scaring Mom. Then there was that time you guys thought I almost drowned and Dad had to. Get to the point already. The infuriated scream was from Kaken. Sorry. Izuku stammered out. Steeling himself once more, he straightened up, took a few deep breaths, and made sure that all eyes were on him as he said his next words. The truth is, Izuku enunciated, loud and clear. I have a quirk. To emphasize his statement, he opened his hand and focused, bringing a stream of water from the bottle on the table into his hand. He led it around his body and tossed it from hand to hand, before dispersing it into vapor at a safe distance away from himself. There was a collective silence from everyone in the living room, and Izuku did a sweep of their faces to gauge their reactions. His mom was visibly shell-shocked, body language instantly giving her away. Still, his dad was the epitome of calmness, and it was commendable that his face remained perfectly smooth, even in the face of such a revelation. Kaken also kept a straight face, but Izuku knew better. Out of the 3 of them, it was his dad who spoke up first. Izuku, his dad leaned forward in his seat. How did this happen? His tone was low and breathless, as if the scene before him was nothing short of an impossibility. And it was, because Masaru had been there himself when Izuku was diagnosed as quirkless. Yet his son twisted and manipulated water like he'd been born for it. I don't know, Dad. Izuku was never one to hide the truth, and when he did, he could never maintain a lie for very long. I guess I was scared of it, and I thought it was temporary at first, like the common cold or something, but it really never went away. Masaru released a long breath from his nose. So why did you feel the need to hide this from your mother, brother, and I? I really didn't mean to hide it for so long. Izuku admitted, averting his eyes to a spot on the wall. Briefly, he wondered how his dad always knew which exact questions to ask him. If the water control was already a shock to them, the next thing that his family would be seeing would be nothing short of a bombshell. It's just that when it got worse, I thought I could deal with it on my own. The teen gulped in preparation for his next words. There's also more to it than just the water control. Before anyone could ask as to what that was, Izuku took the bottle from the table and splashed himself with the water. He squeezed his eyes shut, feeling beads of liquid soak through his clothes and roll down his legs. This was it. There really was no going back now. Even if he wanted to run, there wasn't enough time to get to a bathroom fast enough, and he wouldn't be able to evaporate it in time either. Only when the telltale lightning shock crackled down his spine did he brace his back against the wall. With his legs all but gone, Izuku gracelessly tumbled to the floor. His face was on fire. If his ears were still the same color as the rest of his skin, Izuku was certain they would be beet red. Something about being on the floor, defenseless and out of his element where he could swim and sink and hide, made him feel very, very vulnerable before the rest of his family. Slumped against the wall, Izuku hung his head in shame. Behind closed eyes, he could only imagine the shock, the anger, and the betrayed looks all directed towards him. There would probably be a lot of yelling soon enough. Over me! Izuku's mind supplied, and the resulting guilt weighed him down more than the tale ever could. No sooner than when he fell did the couches creak from the other end of the room, clambering footsteps following in succession. Now Izuku could feel the two presences that had gathered at the side of him. Tentatively, he opened his eyes, not missing the way Kaken's shoulders started when their eyes met. Izuku supposed that it was quite unsettling to see him in his aquatic form for the first time, so it wouldn't be anything to hold against him. But before Izuku was also his mom, who brushed the curls out of his face with gentle fingers. When she withdrew her hand, Izuku realized that his mom was smiling, despite the tears that had gathered at the edge of her own red eyes. "You shitty kid." And the entirety of his body flopped forward when Mitsuki pulled him into a hug. Izuku didn't resist and allowed himself to fall into his mother's embrace. Burying his face in her shoulder, a sob racked his body when she squeezed him even tighter, tears clogging his vision and rolling down his cheeks in fat droplets before he could stop them. Mitsuki had rolled Izuku over at some point while he'd been crying, and now they were both sitting against the wall, Izuku resting in one arm. A broad hand also laid itself on Izuku's shoulder, his dad's hand, and squeezed. His family kept him grounded like nothing else ever could. "Well, Izuku," Masaru spoke, flashing a grin. "I guess this explains the fish cravings." Izuku was dumbfounded, tail swishing anxiously against the rug. "Why, you're not mad?" He sniffed, wiping an arm across his face. For everything that he hid from them, every lie and excuse that he'd spoken, every instant that his family thought he was in danger, Izuku wholeheartedly believed that there should have been more yelling and crying and shouting. Yet it was him that was doing most of the crying. "Why would we ever be mad at you?" Crouched beside Izuku, it was his dad's turn to look puzzled. "We were concerned for you and upset that you hid this from us, but we're not mad," said Masaru, earning an elbow from Mitsuki. "Well, maybe a little mad, but why did you think we'd treat this like it was the end of the world?" Because I had a quirk this whole time, and I hid everything from you guys. You probably thought I joined a gang or something because I was sneaking outside so much at night or worse." "Izuku," Masaru started. "We're more upset that you didn't come to us as soon as this all started. Maybe we could have helped you a little, not as much as you needed, but at least we could have been there for you. If you'd told us sooner, your mom would have probably let you go outside as much as you wanted. Yeah, Mitsuki chimed in. Remember how Katsuki wouldn't stop trying to explode anything he could get his hands on when his quirk manifested? Everyone vividly remembered how nothing was off limits for Katsuki, even Izuku at one point that is, until he'd gotten a very stern talking to and a trip to the quirk counselor. I think it's a rule of thumb that all kids go crazy with their quirks. Even the big ones. She nudged her head in Masaru's direction. Like your prankster of a father. He didn't look guilty in the least. Examining her son's new fishy features, Mitsuki was stunned at just how different her son looked from mere moments ago. The slits on his neck opened and closed frenetically. Gills, her brain supplied. Izuku was frightened out of his mind. Darkened scales covered his shoulders and dotted his face alongside his freckles. Like the final pieces to a puzzle had fit into place, little things that didn't make sense before now had explanations. For instance, Izuku's aquaphobia that had appeared overnight could now be attributed to the fact that he grew scales and a tail at the slightest drop of water. If Izuku was practicing with his powers like Mitsuki suspected he would, because good quirk control just didn't happen right away, then Izuku's constant hunger was also justified. There was something else on Izuku's tail that caught her eye. A stark contrast to the black-green of her son's tail. She would need to get used to associating that word with Izuku. It was a long scar, the one from the wound from those 2 weeks ago, and Mitsuki couldn't help but recall the way Izuku's face had been twisted in cold, desperate fear as he fought tooth and nail to escape the washcloth she held. When Izuku finally realized that his mother was staring at said scar, he subtly shifted the end of his tail out of her line of sight. Izuku. Now it was Kaken who stood over him. From his position on the floor, the blonde looked taller than he'd ever been. Like Mitsuki, his red eyes also noticed the scar overtaking the lower left side of Izuku's tail. If the cut had hit a blood vessel, Katsuki knew it could have been much worse, and he pushed the pang of guilt in his gut aside, letting the burning rage he felt take its place. How long have you been like this? He gritted out. I, Izuku stuttered, more to the floor than Katsuki. 3 months, give or take. There was a tense silence in the room. You son of a beach. Now everyone was looking at Katsuki, whose simmering hands were balled into tight fists. You let me think you were dead. I mean, Izuku's tail anxiously lashed from side to side when he paused. If you're referring to that time on the dock with our classmates, I was never in any real danger, right? 'Cause I could breathe underwater. No. Not that time, you sheet. Katsuki lunged forward, grabbing Izuku by the shoulders. Beneath his grip was a combination of skin and fit. Masaru was ready to intervene before things escalated, especially with Katsuki's combativeness. However, when Mitsuki didn't budge, Masaru automatically knew there was more to the story. Was ready to call the freaking scene for your butt. We both thought you drowned. Izuku stared dumbly, as it seemed like even he didn't have an idea as what Katsuki was talking about. Luckily he clarified. That night with the cut and sheet, when I went to look for you, your tracks led straight into the water, so what did you think we'd assume? Even Mom was expecting for the authorities to bring home your freaking corpse the next day. More than ever, Izuku deeply regretted having ever taken that joy swim in the night. In the short time that Izuku had his powers, it had been one of the many, many times that he put himself before his family. Kaken. Izuku gurgled weakly, wilting under his brother's harsh grip. Why didn't you tell me about this? More tears threatened to fall from his viridian eyes at the new revelation. Because then you'd freaking blame yourself. At that moment, it registered with Katsuki that he'd reduced Izuku to tears with his rant. Like you're doing right now. Cut it out, you self-sacrificing little sheet. No, it was my fault. I should have let you guys know where I was that time. I should have told you all about this sooner. He interjected. And I'm really, really sorry for everything. Then, without warning, Izuku tackled Katsuki in a hug. He would have escaped the embrace, pushed his brother away immediately, as the ash blonde had deemed himself much too old for brotherly hugs long before his quirk had manifested. However, Izuku, who looked as lost and broken as the day he'd been deemed quirkless, was clinging his brother with all the strength he had. For once, Katsuki would make an exception. It was as much as the explosive teen would do with both of their parents being so close, because the guilt would surely follow him for the rest of his life. Taking into mind the dorsal fin on Izuku's back, when the frig did that even get there? Katsuki stiffly and awkwardly returned the hug. Affection wasn't Katsuki's forte, as his main method of communication involved lots of nitroglycerin and some well-placed punches. After having clung to Katsuki like a very fishy sloth and a very sad one at that, Izuku had mostly stopped crying, his sobs having calmed down into sniffles. Still, he'd been muttering for the past minute and a half, every other word coming out of his mouth being some variation of, "I'm sorry." The gooey crap wore on his nerves after a while. "Stop apologizing already. Just don't pull any stupid sheet again without telling anyone first. Stop pulling stupid sheet PRD. Could you please not scream in my ear?" Izuku flinched back at the loudness. "I'm trying to be nice here. Do you want a freaking hug or not?" Then Katsuki got a good look at his shoulder. "Hey! Don't you dare get your shitty snot on my favorite gym shirt." Kaken," spoke Izuku, trying to figure out a way to say his next words without sending Katsuki into a seething rage. "Why, you're actually kind of hurting me now." The hug had become more of a death grip at this point. "Boys?" Mitsuki said dangerously. "Disgusting." Katsuki growled, untwisting from the hug and shooting off the floor. Just because you can turn into a fish doesn't mean you're entitled to be disgusting like one. Izuku slumped back against the wall in relief, relishing in the feeling of blood returning to his extremities. Just as he was about to fire off a retort of his own, a flash sent the room alight, and everybody had to cover their eyes at the sudden brightness. When the light cleared, Izuku was back to normal, clothes, skin, and legs all returned to his being. The only remaining evidence showing that he'd ever been that curious cross between boy and fish were the tail-like imprints left behind on the rug. Ever the gentleman, Masaru helped Mitsuki and Izuku off the floor with a hand. Neither Masaru nor Mitsuki had it in them to cook dinner tonight, especially after all that had just happened, so Masaru was the first to ask the room, "Who wants Chinese tonight?" Unsurprisingly, no one disagreed. That sounds great. Just let me get a jacket first." Izuku was braced against the wall, no amount of willpower hiding how his legs quivered beneath him. The simple task of standing up took a lot of effort on his part, even when his dad had helped him. Still, several minutes in his aquatic form rendered his legs weak and unresponsive. His mom and dad were certainly watching as he tried to stay upright. He kept his eyes to the floor, not wanting them to see the desperation in his green eyes that had begun anew, which had quickly taken its root amongst the mass of his already haywire emotions. The door frame was about a meter or more from Izuku's reach. He only needed to fall just so, and if he grabbed the door frame, he could use the hallway's narrowed walls to support him up the stairs and to his bedroom. In theory, it would have worked, if not for Izuku's staggering lack of coordination. When he pushed off the wall, the only thing his hands could find was air. Before face met floor, however, one arm caught Izuku mid-fall, while the other lifted him by the collar of his shirt and back into a standing position. Izuku didn't even have to look up to know who'd helped him. The silence was enough of an indicator, and Katsuki didn't need words to know just how much Izuku appreciated the help. The remnants of the guilt and grief that had threatened to drown him were gone, hope and gratitude blooming in their place. Hidden by overgrown bangs and a downcast head, the wobbly smile that broke on Izuku's face overcame any tears he had left. So, even if Kaken would disapprove, Izuku uttered his gratefulness anyway. "Thanks, Kaken." It was simple enough, but between two brothers, the words spoke volumes. "Mom, Dad, Kaken and I are going to practice our quirks on the beach. Be careful, boys," called Masaru from his workroom. "Don't do anything stupid," Mitsuki yelled in a similar fashion. Izuku couldn't help but laugh. "See you, Mom and Dad." And he dashed down in the direction of Dagoba Beach. "Watch your brother, Katsuki." "I will, Mom." Katsuki huffed, but it was drowned out by the slamming of the door. By the time he crossed the threshold of garbage that separated road from beach, Izuku was already at the opposite end pulling several large globes of water from the sea. He stopped. When he finally noticed Katsuki, shifting into some semblance of a fighting stance. Are we doing this on a count of 3, or is it going to be a? Katsuki lit off a sizable explosion, and Izuku skidded out of its path. Having nearly fallen at the jump scare, green-haired teen gave him a stink eye before throwing a hand forward, launching one of the globes at Katsuki. Effortlessly, he dissipated it with another burst of his power. Is that all you got, Izuku? Katsuki taunted. He was smirking, but there was no malice behind it. And to think that 3 months of practice would give you an edge. Izuku also had a grin on his face, but there was a glint in his eyes, like he had some trick up his sleeve. And Katsuki realized that Izuku actually did when he spread his fingers apart and moved his hand forward. Before Katsuki could explode the liquid projectile that sped towards him, the water spread out and dissipated into a very thick cloud of steam. The sneaky sheet. The steam was so dense that Katsuki could barely see anything in front of him, which is why he didn't even register the large stream of water that shot at his feet. He felt the impact of it though, and it sent him careening into the sand. When the steam cleared, Izuku's expression was neither impish nor smug. For one, he looked relieved that Katsuki hadn't fallen too badly from the attack. His face was also in disbelief, as if he hadn't been the one to knock down his brother by his own hand. The lack of confidence Izuku had was stunning sometimes. Until Izuku became more proficient fighting with his quirk, and Katsuki would eat dirt before he ever told Izuku, he would have to go easy on his brother unless he got cocky, of course. Then Katsuki would need to show Izuku who was boss. Eat this, Izuku. Katsuki was unable to stop the next words that came out of his mouth. He blamed overcompetitiveness, which really couldn't be helped in his case. The next explosion detonated into the dirt, sending bits of sand and rubble flying all over. It wasn't meant to harm, more for show than anything else, but Izuku didn't need to know that either. He ran off towards the edge of the beach, firing off his last 2 globes as a distraction. Poorly aimed in his haste, they missed Katsuki by a long shot. Only a moment's focus was needed on Izuku's behalf to start gathering another army of liquid spheres. Therefore, in a split-second decision, Katsuki made a running jump just as Izuku was calling more water to himself, and pinned his brother to the sand, the columns of water falling back into the sea. Izuku squirmed on his stomach, more out of indignation than anything else, because Katsuki had even made sure to grab his fingers too. You win, Kaken. Izuku conceded, and his brother released his hold. As he pushed himself up from the sand, he then asked Katsuki. Again. The ash blonde nodded. Best 2 out of 3? Katsuki made another gesture of agreement, and Izuku brought several more large orbs of water, more than he had for the first round, to himself, and smiled likewise. This time, I'm going all out. If you didn't, then that would make me the superior sibling by default. Katsuki's hands crackled in response. So show me what you can do with that power of yours. Katsuki dove forward, and Izuku followed suit. Izuku won the second round by encasing Katsuki with water, thereby rendering his explosions useless. When he'd blown up the water around himself, even more would come to take its place. The move was effective and irksome at the same time. With the last rays of sunlight having disappeared beneath the sea, it was nearly nightfall by the time the two began the tiebreaker, explosions lighting up the dusk like fireworks and globes of water glimmering in the moonlight. Doubled over at the opposite end of the beach, Izuku was exhausted from the extended physical activity. Even though Katsuki dragged Izuku to the gym more often since he told his family about his quirk, Izuku still had a long way to go in terms of speed, strength, and stamina, which was why Katsuki had barely needed his quirk to win the final round. Hidden behind the mounds of trash, Yagi Toshinori observed the colorful display of fire and water and smiled. It seemed that everything had worked out for Izuku after all. The two brothers were young, but their respective quirks were quite strong for their ages. Even for the enigmatic Izuku, whose quirk had manifested so late in life, with a little more time, his control of water would soon be second nature. If they were going to enter a hero course, Toshinori was certain that, someday, the two brothers would both become excellent pro-heroes. There was something about running around the beach with Kaken that made Izuku feel like a little kid again. Even with the amount of garbage that made Dagoba Beach unrecognizable, nothing had really changed. Now, with his secret out in the open, perhaps there was a greater joy to these romps, since Izuku had a quirk of his own. Overprotective and explosive and haughty, Kaken was still Kaken, still the same brother that Izuku had grown up with his whole life, and still the same brother he cared for more than anything in the world. His mom's fierce and caring attitude still shone forth in the way she protected the household, always spoke her mind, and almost dared for anyone to take a shot at her family, and his dad still was the same calm backbone of the family and a great advice giver, who provided both jokes and insight in equal parts. Furthermore, even with everything that had happened to him, the powers, fins, and all, Izuku hadn't really changed either. Even with his former quirklessness, numerous oddities, and incurable emotionality, his mom and dad and brothers still loved him for every last bit of him. Because if Izuku learned anything from this ordeal, it was that, at the end of the day, this chaotic mess of people that was his family would always have his back, they would always be there for him. It really was that simple. Izuku loved his family and they loved him. And nothing would ever change that.